This week's Parshat Bereishit, contains within it the fascinating story of Cain and Hevel. Of course, the general outlines of the story are familiar to all of us. Cain and Hevel are born, they're named, they adopt certain professions. Cain brings an offering to God. God does not accept Cain's offering. Instead, he accepts Hevel's offering. Cain becomes upset. God warns Cain. Cain speaks with Hevel. Cain kills Hevel. Cain is punished. This fascinating short story, there are many, many questions that can be raised, ranging from the point of the professions to why Cain kills Hevel. But in place of discussing any particular specific questions in terms of the thicken of the narrative, here I would like to discuss a broader question which has intrigued many modern commentaries on the Torah. And that is, why is this interesting story of fratricide, of the murder of Hevel by Cain, included in the Torah altogether? What is the primary meaning and message of the story that the Torah thought that it was worthwhile to place it early on in the central point in Sefer Bereishit? Over the course of time, I've become convinced that there's a fascinating literary parallel, a fascinating connection between the story of Cain and Hevel, what might be thought of as the second sin found in the Torah, and a prior story found in Parshat Bereishit, what we often think of as the first sin, or sometimes the Chet HaRishon, as we might say in modern Hebrew. This becomes evident if we take a look at some of the psukim, beginning with the point in time where God intervenes for a second time and confronts Cain regarding his deeds. And I'm going to read a few of the psukim here, and jump back and forth between the second sin, the sin of Cain and the killing of Hevel, and the first sin, of course, the sin of Eitzadat Tovara, of Adam v'Ishto, eating of the fruit of the Eitzadat Tovara. So here, in Parshat Bereishit, in Perek Dalet, Pasuk Yud, God confronts Cain and says as follows, Vayomer Hashem el Cain, E Hevel achicha. God confronts Cain and asks a location question. Well, if we think about it, this should be eerily familiar to us. If we go back to the moment to Perek Gimel Pasuk Tet, Vayikra Hashem Elokim Adam Vayomer lo Ayeka. Where are you? God confronts Adam and asks a location question. Of course, if we move further along, Cain's response. How does Cain respond? Cain says, Vayomer lo yodati hashomer achi anochi. Oh, I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper? Well, of course, on some level, it's not just that Cain denies responsibility, but he even blames someone else. He accuses God of being the real shomer of his brother. So he utilizes the word anochi, and he blames another, and he shirks responsibility. But of course, that's exactly the same thing that happened in the story of Eitzadat Tovara. Adam says, Va'ira kerom anochi va'echaveh. He uses the anochi word. And then a few psukim later, he says in Pasuk Yud Bet, Vayomer Adam ha'isha shenatata imadi, hi natna li mina eitz va'ochel. Well, it was her fault. But God, it was you who gave her to me. So effectively, it was God's fault. So again, it's the same blame game, the same shirking of responsibility, and the same usage of the Anochi term, and that's a second parallel between the two stories. As we go on, it becomes even more obvious and clearer. God uses a unique locution in countering Cain's claim. Perek Dalet Pasuk Yud, Vayomer Ma'asita, what have you done? And that's more confrontational. But of course, that's an echo of what previously God had said to Isha in Perek Gimel Pasuk Yud Gimel. Vayomer Hashem Elokim leIsha Mazot Asita. Again, the Ma'asita, what have you done? And most importantly, the fourth point of parallel between the two stories is they both end with a curse, a klala, or in the language of the Tanakh, a roar that involves the Adama. Hashem says to Cain in Perek Dalet Pasuk Yud Aleph, V'ata arur ata min Adama asher patzta et pia lakachet et mei achicha miyadecha ki tavod et Adama lo tasef teit kochalach. The ground is cursed, agriculture will be difficult, it will be impossible, you'll have to be a wanderer. So there's the mention of the Adama and there's the mention of the arur term as the culmination of the God-Cain conversation and the punishment for Cain's actions. But of course, this is exactly what happened in the story of Eitzadat Tovara. It's effectively Ein Chadash Tachat HaShemesh. The same thing has already occurred. If we go back for the moment to Perek Gimel, we're told there in Perek Gimel Pasuk Yud Zayin, Uladam Amar Ki Shamata L'Kol Ishtecha V'Tochal Min Ha'etz Asher Tzivita Le'imar Lo Tochal Mimenu Arura Ha'adama Ba'avurecha Be'itzavon Tochalena Kol Yemei Chayecha. The ground is cursed. It will sprout thorns and thistles. Agriculture will be difficult. The same language, the same arur, the same adama, and the same ideas, the same culmination of the two stories. I could go on because there are many, many other points of parallel. For example, the unique language of tishukah, of desire, and mishilut, and rulership is used in both stories. And even, for example, both stories exhibit a unique concern with issues of hiding the Shekhinah and Gerushin being sent away. And this I'll focus on as the last point of parallel between the two stories. Cain eventually responds and says to God, in complaining regarding his punishment in Pasuk Yudalid, Hein girashti oti hayom me'al pnei adama umipanecha esater vayiti navanad ba'aretz vayiti kol motzei yahargeni. You have sent me away from the Adamah completely. Mipanecha esater, I'll be hidden from the face of God. I can't be close to God. And death is on the table for me, Cain says. Again, this is if counting the way I did today, this is a sixth point of parallel between the two stories. Of course, Adam hides. Va'echaveh, I hid because I was naked. And of course, at the end of the story of the Chet Eitzadat Tovara, Perek Gimel Pasuk Kafdal tells us, Bereishit Adam ve'yashkein mikedem legan Eden et hakruvim ve'lahat hacherev. The place where God is present is Gan Eden. They heard Kol Hashem et Halech Bagan. They are sent away. Gerushin is the language. They are sent away from Shekhinah, just like later on in the Cain story. And of course, their eventual fate is death, just as Cain laments his fate. So apparently, there's an extensive connection between these two stories. The story of Eitzadat Tovara, the Chet HaRishon, the original sin, or the first sin of Parshat Bereishit, and the second story, the story of Cain v'Hevel, the story of fratricide, the second sin found in Sefer Bereishit. What is the meaning of this connection? What is the point of connecting these two stories in this way, of the Torah's paralleling? What does it mean? What does it inform us of, and what does it teach us? Often, in thinking about these kinds of parallels between stories, it's often important to also think about the differences, because sometimes it's in the contrasts that we find the point of connection between the two stories. And what I'd like to do very briefly is to investigate the nature, the particular essence of these two particular sins, and note that it strikes us as being slightly different from each other, and this might in fact be a key to unlocking the connection. If we go back to Perek Bet, Pasuk Tet Zayin, when the Adam is first commanded what to do and what not to do when he's placed in Gan Eden, the Torah tells us as follows in Perek Bet, Pasuk Tet Zayin. Veitzav Hashem Elokim al Adam le'emar, Mikol eitz hagan acho tochel, u'me'etz hadat tovara lo tochal mimenu. Well, you'll die if you eat from it. There's no real reason for it. It's simply top down. It's divine authority. It's what we might call the vertical axis, the God-man relationship. It doesn't have an obvious reason. It's what we think of as a chok in the latter language of Sefer Shmot and Sefer Dvarim, a kind of divine fiat, something man just has to do, a matter of pure obedience. Such is not the case with the second sin, the sin of Cain and Hevel, the sin of fratricide. There's in fact, although God does attempt intervention, there is no warning, there is no command. Man, or Cain, is actually supposed to understand intuitively or naturally that killing one's brother is really not the right thing to do, or assaulting one's brother, or blaming someone else for their problems. And it's ben adam l'chavero. It's the horizontal axis of life. It's reason, it's intuition, it's morality, it's ethics. What the Torah tells us here by connecting these two stories is that the idea of chok and the idea of mishpat are the same. That the vertical axis, the God-man relationship, ben adam lamakom, and the horizontal axis, ben adam l'chavero, are really the same. God cares about both of these things. Religion and ethics, or what we might chok v'mishpat, we might call in modern Hebrew dat v'musar, are really one unit, one thing. This, in fact, is the great truth of ethical monotheism taught in the Torah, which will later be taught by Avraham Avinu, and later on in Sefer Dvarim once again. The Torah connects these two stories, and here it differs from much of what was present in ancient Near Eastern culture. It tells us that God cares about both these things, ben adam l'makom, ben adam l'chavero, not just divine authority, but also intuition, musar, and morals. And maybe that's the point of the connection of these two stories. But I want to make one last point, and here on a deeper level, there's also a progression between the two stories. At first, when man is sent out of Gan Eden for being over on the chok, for violating divine authority, he's allowed to live somewhere nearby. He's sent out, but he lives kedem le'eden, as the last pasuk of Perek Gimel tells us. He still works the Adama. He has some sort of connection to the world of Gan Eden. But after fratricide, after ben adam l'chavero, after violating what Rav Kook might call musar TV, then man is truly alienated from God, from Gan Eden. He cannot work the Adama. He wanders, he moves to a completely different mode of existence. And here we should realize that often we think about religion and connection to Shekhinah as primarily about chukim, the vertical axis, divine authority. But the Torah here teaches us that it's also, and even maybe on some level more so, about the horizontal axes, morality, ethics, musar. And if we wish to get closer to Shekhinah and to return to the world of Gan Eden, at least metaphorically, we certainly have our work cut out for us.